G'day everyone, welcome to Shooting the Breeze with Lady Liberty. I am Lady Liberty Australia, or Kate Fantanell, and I am sitting here today with one of my dear friends, the Honourable John Ruddick at his New South Wales Parliament office. JR, it's great to see you. Thanks for having us here.
Thanks for coming in, Kate. Lovely to meet you today.
Lovely to see you again. So I've had you on my show before when Javier Milei was elected in Argentina, and we had a bit of a chat about that. And just before we were talking about how you had the opportunity to go over for his inauguration. How did you find that, and how are you reading the situation in Argentina now? Because he seems to be getting runs on the board. He's got the hyperinflation under control more than it was, at least. People seem to be having more money. There's not as many people living in poverty. How did you find Argentina, and what's your thoughts on President Javier Milei?
When I was a teenager in the 1980s, you often heard in Australian newspapers and media about how Argentina used to be this wealthy country, used to be, had the highest living standards in the world, and it fell over. And then I went there a year ago. And you walk around Buenos Aires and you can tell that the place was once a very prosperous city. The buildings are beautiful. Now, Sydney has beautiful colonial buildings, but they're grander in Buenos Aires. They're like 50% bigger. And, there's beautiful boulevards and streets, and it's all planned out. And it's all very nice. But the place is in decay. They've had 60 years of bad government, mostly socialist. And the people sort of seem to have had the spirit knocked out of them, which is what happens when you lived under a socialist rule. And, very few people spoke English. Even Javier Milei doesn't seem to speak that much English. Because I think after the Falkland Islands War in the early 1980s, the Argentinians became very anti-British. So they became buddies with all the baddies out there, Cuba, and Venezuela, China, Russia, and it hasn't worked out for them. So Milei's come along. Now he's a very unusual combination of factors. Firstly, most importantly, he is an extremely intellectual person. He's written 50 academic papers. So that's unlike most politicians. Secondly, he's not just a libertarian, he's like a radical libertarian. He's a proud anarcho-capitalist. And thirdly, he's unbelievably charismatic. Okay. He just stands out. Even the left-wing media like talking about Javier Milei. So, and he's won the presidency there reasonably comfortable, out of just sort of getting involved in politics like 3 or 4 years ago. He's just absolutely, it's been a democratic revolution. Now, how's he going? Well, Argentina is naturally a very wealthy country, used to be very prosperous, so they do know how to do it. They've had terrible management, and the place has got serious levels of poverty. Now, what happens when you have a wrecked or a badly managed economy, like, say, Britain in the 1950s, 60s and 70s, where it was sort of, the slow road to socialism, whether it was Labour or the Tories, they just sort of were heading in that same direction, bigger and bigger government. Then Thatcher comes along in 1979 and she says, well, look, we've got to, the first thing we have to do is kill the inflation. Now, when we kill the inflation, there's going to be some economic pain associated with it. We might even go into recession. And that's what happened. Britain went into a recession. And a lot of people were saying, oh my God, this is terrible. These Thatcherite reforms aren't working. These free market reforms aren't working. But she said, no, we're going to stay the course. We're not going to do the U-turn. And then 3 or 4 years later, everyone's saying, wow, Britain's really bounced back with strength. And then the rest of the world started following Thatcherism and Reaganism. Bob Hawke in this country was a trade union leader from the Labor Party. He basically just copied Margaret Thatcher's reforms. That's why Australia had a very good economy for 20, 30 years. Now, so I think with Milei, Argentina was in a much worse position than Britain was in 1979. But I'm a big fan of Margaret Thatcher, but Milei is a lot better than Thatcher because she was a classical liberal. Okay, she still thought the state was fundamentally a good thing. She wanted it to be small. That's good. Okay, but Milei says, well, look, we're not going to abolish the state overnight, but we do fundamentally think of it as a criminal agency. It can only do bad things. So Milei's come in with these radical reforms, and he's killed the inflation. And they've cut a hell of a lot of spending, and they've now got a budget surplus. But there is still. Milei said it at the time. I said it at the time. I think I said it on your show, Kate, that it's going to get worse for 2 years. Okay, but so far the indications are that it's turning around a lot quicker than we thought it would. And I think it looks like we're already through the worst of it. One of the things that he's doing in a huge way is because he's so charismatic and he's so pro-business and investment, he's basically just said, he's opened the door, say, come and invest in Argentina. Elon Musk is talking about building a Tesla plant there. And people are saying, well, look, the currency's so low, it is fundamentally a rich country, badly run government, and the people have been suffering. But, so money's flowing in there. I think it's going to be, I think I'm pro-President Trump. I think he's a very positive influence in the world. But I think Milei is the one who can truly, for the first time in history, demonstrate to the world that radical libertarianism makes human beings happy and successful and dynamic and innovative.
So in comparison to Argentina, how are you feeling about how Australia is going? So we're having, I just got back from America, and even in the 3 months that I was gone, the prices of everything has just gone through the roof. It's hard for people to pay rent. Even finding a home anymore is difficult. You see people struggling at Christmas time, the worst time. People can't afford presents. Do you feel like Australia is on the same track as Argentina, or do you think we're not that bad yet, but do you think it's a slippery slope and we need a Javier or a Trump-like figure in Australia to put us back on track?
Yes, we need a radical change in direction. Now, we are in a bad way economically. We've been in a per capita recession for about 6 quarters. So if we hadn't been having all this record high immigration, our headline would be, Australia's in a long-term recession here. And you're right, the inflation is biting everybody. Now, who's caused this? It would be very short-sighted and superficial to say it's all Anthony Albanese's fault. Now, he certainly has made it worse. Okay. However, we had 10 years of coalition government prior to that. Tony Abbott, Malcolm Turnbull, Scott Morrison. These economic trends take a long time to sort of flow through to the system. Under that so-called Liberal government, and the Liberal Party has, generally speaking, been good on economics, but they've lost their way in a very big way. Now, when Rudd became the Prime Minister in 2007, the first time, defeated John Howard, John Howard handed over a $20 billion Commonwealth debt, which is nothing. It's like owning a $100 million house and having a $100,000 line of credit on it. And so $20 billion was nothing. So I'm a critic of John Howard in many ways, but look, he did hand over no government debt, so that's a big positive for him. Now then, after 6 years of Rudd and Gillard, the Commonwealth debt got up to $256 billion. And at the time, Tony Abbott, as the opposition leader, and Joe Hockey, as the opposition treasurer, were trying to alarm the people and saying, this debt is out of control. Vote Liberal and stop this endless debt. And I was saying at the time, look, 256 billion, be better if it was zero, but this is not a crisis. Should be lower. We should be paying it off, yes, but don't scare the people because it's still very, very manageable. We make about $2 trillion a year, every year in our GDP. So it's not good. No, that's better, but it wasn't a crisis. But my point is they were saying how much of a massive crisis it is. Now, then what happens is, before COVID, so under Tony Abbott and Malcolm Turnbull, that debt had then got up to about 580 billion. We didn't have a recession, we didn't have a war, just the Liberal Party couldn't help spending. That's what it was. They just had a spending addiction, not a revenue addiction. They just couldn't help themselves. They were worse than Labor. And then a little thing called COVID came along, the BS pandemic. And then we got it up to about $1 trillion under Scott Morrison. Okay, and the Liberal. But the worst part about it is we never had much hope that Scott Morrison was going to be good fiscally. But where were the cabinet resignations? Where were people saying, I can't abide by this? No, they all went along with it. Similar here in New South Wales. We had a 12-year Liberal government, handed over a massive debt. So Now, I think that the coming federal election, but if we just talk about it between Albanese and Dutton, is looking like it's going to be pretty tight election. And, you know, Albanese, I don't think is really enjoying the job much. And, you know, Dutton seems to run a very disciplined campaign, but I don't think things are going to change much if Peter Dutton wins. I think it will be better. It'll be like the decline will be, there'll be a bit of a handbrake on the decline. So what we definitely do need, Kate, yes, is we do need a radical change. And we believe that, you know, the Libertarian Party is best placed to do that. We're running a field of good Senate candidates. So we think that, you know, the Milei revolution and the Trump revolution will eventually have to, if they're successful, and I believe they will be successful, it will have an impact on Australia.
So just going back a step, I know you were involved in the Liberal Party for quite some years. What was it that made you change your mind and come across to libertarianism? Is there an issue, or was it just the Liberal Party is so useless? What was the changing point in your life that made you want to be a libertarian representative of the people in New South Wales?
Well, I had written a book in 2018 called Make the Liberal Party Great Again, which sort of had a sexy title, but it was a manual or a blueprint on how a major political party should be constituted. And it was sort of talking very much about democratic reform. It was saying the parliamentary leader, so Peter Dutton or, you know, Mark Speakman here in New South Wales, would be elected by a convention of all the Liberal Party members. This is how they elected that magnificent opposition leader in Canada, who's going to be the next Prime Minister. I can't pronounce his surname, the French guy, but he's a great, fantastic fellow. He got elected because 700,000 members of the Canadian Conservative Party had a convention and they said, we want this guy to be our leader. He would never have won through the party room. So I said, now Scott Morrison was opposed to it. John Howard came out and was opposed to it. So I said to myself in 2018, I said, well, guess what? I'm going to wait you guys out. I am going to keep fighting for these reforms. I've got other major constitutional reforms through the Liberal Party in the last 30 years. And I thought this will take 10 years, but I will win this war. And I was just going to wait them out. And then what happened was COVID comes along and I was just instantly pulling my hair out saying, this is the biggest load of crap I've ever seen in my life. I can't believe everyone's falling for it. And it was libertarians all around the world who in the early days, like your friend Topher Field, he came out, Gideon Rosner, Dave Smith, Jeremy Kaufman, the only people on the spectrum, the political spectrum, who when COVID first came out were saying, okay, this is madness, this is a hysteria, this is dangerous, this is just a bad flu. The only people saying it were radical libertarians. The mainstream right, you know, most of the Republican Party, including Donald Trump, the Liberal Party, John Howard was saying, oh, who cares about the deficit? Just we've got to spend money to save us from this bad flu. He fell for it. Tony Abbott was sort of okay on it. He should have spoken out more than he did, particularly against the mandatory vaccines, which didn't work. Anyway, so COVID came along and I was just like, couldn't, but the lockdowns, the masks, the compulsory vaccination, all brought to us by the Liberal Party. And so that sent me over the edge. Global warming. Scott Morrison won the 2019 election by saying he won't get us into Paris. Well, something happened along the way. He gets tricked. He says, oh, well, we've got this global warming is so important now. And then the $1 trillion debt, which we discussed a few minutes ago. So those three things I said, you know what? Over and out. This party's beyond redemption. And then I was thinking, what am I going to do? And I gave up. I said, look, you know, I said, it's not just the leadership. It's not just Berejiklian and Morrison and John Howard. It's the cabinet. It's the backbench. Now, Craig Kelly spoke out, and Alex Antic and Matt Canavan, Jared Rennick. These were very good people. But there was bugger all of them. If it was Malcolm Fraser doing the same thing in the 1970s, there would have been 2/3 of this cabinet would have resigned. I said, Mr. Prime Minister, we're not going to be putting up with mandatory vaccinations and lockdowns. So that's when I thought, well, what am I going to do? So then I had first heard about the Liberal Democrats in 2012 when they won 2 council spots in New South Wales. I said, who are these guys? I looked up their website. I said, oh, these guys are fantastic. I went and met with your good friend David Linehill before he was a senator. And I was, really tempted to jump ship earlier because, look, I'd always I'd read Ayn Rand's Atlas Shrugged when I was about 22, and I really read it. It's a long book. Like, it took me about 6 months. I read it, I took notes, I underlined things. Like, I loved Atlas Shrugged. And Milton Friedman. Okay. And then, so I was tempted to it, but I thought, no, if we really want to change Australia, we've got to reform the Liberal Party first. And then when I gave up in mid 2021, when Gladys just announced another 2-week lockdown, which turned into 5 months, that's when I said, look, I've got to go somewhere else. Then I was turned on The Outsiders on Sunday morning, and I saw Rita Panahi introduce David Limbrick, your friend from Victoria. I saw him Rita introduced David Limbrick and said, this is the real opposition leader here in Victoria. And I thought, oh, cool. I've never heard of him before. And I watched that, and I got off, and I rang up Ross Cameron, whose son I knew was involved in the Liberal Democrats at the time. I just rang Ross. I said, Ross, I've decided I'm going to join the Liberal Democrats. Have you got your son's number? I want to get the ball rolling. So that's how that happened.
Yeah, well, you were one of the first to speak out against the COVID bullshit. I remember seeing you on the news. Did that take a lot of courage? Were you concerned that we didn't really know a lot of information at the time and everyone was panicking? I was in Western Australia, so the border was closed there from March 2020 until June 2022, a bit longer than that. So it was a different experience over West. But being in Sydney, what was it like to live through that time? And do you think we'll ever get an apology for how they treated us?
Well, what happened was, I do remember in about 2006, there was a bit of an alarm about SARS. And I thought to myself, as someone who's interested in history as a hobby for most of my life, there have been some pretty serious plagues in humanity, like the old Black Death wiped out about, 40% of Europe. And there was some very bad plagues in ancient Rome. And I thought, that we might have to be a lot of hype. Then when COVID comes along, I thought, okay, here we go. I was skeptical of it. And then it started with these people in China walking along the street, bong. And I thought, well, that's crap. Who does that? But people were freaked out by it. I thought, that doesn't look right. If you've got a cold, you're not going to be just walking out normal and just fall over flat. So then there's all this crazy data coming out from China. So you've got to be a little bit alarmed about it. But then I immediately became a COVID skeptic in mid-March 2020, which is early on, because COVID had escaped China and was in Italy. Now, we can't trust the data that comes out of China. We just don't know it, right? It's in a different language and Communist Party and everything. But Italy's a Western country, G7 country, OECD. And it hits Italy. And I remember I woke up one morning, I read the Sydney Morning Herald, 500 people have died overnight of this disease in Italy. And I immediately thought, well, that sounds pretty bad. I thought, 500 might be 5,000 tomorrow. Okay, this might be the Antonine Plague, from ancient Rome or something. But then I read further down in the article that 95% of people that had died were over the age of 82 and had 2 comorbidities. So I thought, well, that's a relief. Okay, every winter there's a flu, and who does it kill? Old people who are on the verge of death anyway. Hate to sound callous about it, but that's how I look at it. The Spanish flu was a very bad flu straight after World War I. 50 million people dead when the world's population was less than half of what it is today. And weirdly, what was very, very, very bad about that Spanish flu was killing young people in their prime, in their 20s. And we don't want that. So when I thought, okay, it's affecting not just 80-year-olds, you're going to have 2 other sicknesses. So I thought, well, okay, this sounds like a worse flu than normal. So let's look after grandma and grandpa. And the best way to have done that would have been through family and community, not the state imposing lockdowns. But everybody else under the age of 70 who's in reasonably good shape could basically soldier on. We didn't have to have the lockdowns and all the BS and all the debt and all that's what's given us the inflation, all that crap. And so I thought, well, that's what we should do. We should basically we should say, look, there's a particularly bad flu out there, and it might kill grandma and grandpa. So we would strongly advise you to, leave food at their back door. Don't go in to see them, or see them as little as possible, so you don't infect them with this potentially bad flu that might kill them. That's all we should have done with silly COVID. And then, of course, the worst part about it, of course, was the warp speed vaccination. Okay, and I had worked at Pfizer. I sometimes say that at these freedom rallies, and the people almost want to throw a rotten egg at me. But I worked at Pfizer for 5 months before they rightly sacked me for chronic underperformance. And this was in 1998, because I'd been working for Ross Cameron, who was the Liberal federal member for Parramatta, and the Pfizer plant and corporate HQ was in the federal seat of Parramatta, and we'd become chummy with them. And they were setting up a government relations department, and they offered to substantially increase my pay. Ross was all fine with it, and so I was working there. And on my first day, the big Pfizer executive says to me, "John, here's your American Express gold card." I said, "Cool. So what do I actually do in this job?" And I said, "Okay, well, your job, John, we want you to go out there and take journalists, politicians, and regulators out to breakfast, lunch, and dinner. We'll pay for it." And I said, "Okay, cool. Well, that's an easy job." And then I said, "What do I say to them?" And they said, "Well, John, you just got to get the word out there that Pfizer's here. We're a big employer, do good things. And but we need the government to know, because the government's their biggest customer, because all the subsidies, et cetera, and the government's got to approve whether they can sell a drug. So the government's everything for these big pharma businesses. Crony capitalism is the word that comes to mind. But they said, look, John, for every time, they employ all these thousands of scientists that come up with ideas for new drugs, right? For every time the scientists come up with 40 concept drugs, only one will ever get to market." And I said, "Oh, okay, why is that?" They said, "Unintended side effects." So they said, we could have a disease, a vaccine that we think fixes up your kidney, and it might fix up your kidney, but 3 years later it blows up your heart, okay, whatever. So they have to just rigorously test it for 10 years. They say 1 out of 40 gets there. Then they also said it takes 10 to 15 years to get to market. And I said, "Why?" They said, "Unintended side effects." I said, "Okay, well, that makes sense." And I'm sure they were telling me the truth at that time, because it makes sense, doesn't it? Now, with these vaccines are potent little things. You want to get them right. Okay. Now, so then when the warp speed vaccine comes out, I can remember a few mates saying, "Oh, John, isn't this great? This COVID thing's going to be, we're going to get a vaccine." I said, "Well, I'm not taking it. Pfizer told me not to take it. They said it's rushed. They even called it warp speed vaccine." So then we had to put up with all that crap, until the best thing about the vaccination program was when everyone worked out very quickly that it doesn't work. At best, it doesn't work. Might even harm people. Okay, I think they're trying to suppress debate about whether it's harming people, which makes me think it probably is, but I don't know. I'm not a scientist. But I know that the excess deaths are up ever since we all, 98% of people took the silly warp speed vaccine. So yes, the COVID thing was a big deal, and I hope. Look, it made more people libertarian. I wish it made a hell of a lot more, but I think people are getting sceptical of government now.
Yeah. Well, another pro-advocate against all the COVID bullshit was Craig Kelly. And last night, I've just heard today that he has been pre-selected as the lead Senate candidate for New South Wales. You were the last lead Senate candidate for New South Wales, and I was the WA lead Senate candidate for the Liberal Democrats. Yes. So that's very exciting to have Craig. And how's he feeling about that? Is everyone ready for the election? I feel like everyone's waiting for the announcement of the date, which should be May, because WA has their state election in March. So we're all tipping May. How do you feel we'll go this time? Because there was so much momentum when we ran at that last Senate election, and it was a bit disappointing to still not really crack more than 3% across the board for the Senate. How's it feeling this time, like with Twitter and the free speech stuff that's been coming out and us fighting for our rights? Do you think maybe this time we'll see an increase in the vote for Libertarians, especially with Craig Kelly there as the lead candidate?
Look, I think Craig is definitely going to add to our electoral appeal. I think Jordan Ditloff in Victoria is doing a fabulous job. Now, I think that, look, we had at the last federal election, we had three parties which were sceptical of COVID. We had the United Australia Party with Clive Palmer. We had the Liberal Democrats, which Libertarian Party. And we had One Nation. Now, One Nation were late to the party on COVID scepticism, but they did get there eventually. Whereas, and the UAP, well, the Libertarians, of course, were first out of the block to say this is BS. But now what's happened since then is the UAP is quite possible, some say probable, but that they won't be able to contest the next election because they have voluntarily deregistered, and that on a technicality that knocks them out. But I don't think it's very fair. But I think but Clive Palmer is testing that in the High Court. Now then, look, the One Nation does seem to be particularly focused on Queensland and getting Malcolm Roberts re-elected, who we all love Malcolm Roberts. Now then but in New South Wales, I think we do have, if there's no UAP and One Nation's not putting in a concerted effort here, and Craig's well known. He was a federal Liberal Party MP for a decade, and he's got a very big social media following. And look, on the two biggest attempts by the government to become a lot bigger and bossier in the last 10 years, Craig Kelly stuck his neck out more than anybody. Global warming and COVID. And look, he's fundamentally a very decent, good guy. And he's really passionate about politics. Look, he should write a book called Craig Kelly Was Right. He gets, he won in 2017 when they first came out with this statement of the heart, Uluru, whatever. Craig came out and said, well, I know where this is going to end up. It's going to end up as trying to enshrine race into our constitution. He said it in 2017. So, look, I think it'll be fabulous if he wins. He needs about 7% of the vote. So we got about 2.2 here at the last federal election. I think the UAP got about 3.4. We add that together. What's that add up to? It's about 6, isn't it? 3.4, yes, almost 6. And then, we've had the Milei revolution, the Trump revolution. I think really feel like since Trump won, there has been a shift away from woke BS. The Melbourne Storm said they're not going to do welcome to country. There's still a lot of woke BS out there, but I feel like the tide has turned eventually, taken its time. So now then it's I think at the last election, a lot of conservative voters were cranky with Morrison, compulsory vaccines and other things. Now, what would be disappointing is that a lot of Liberal voters who were very disappointed with the last Liberal government might mistakenly think, it'll all be better now they've learnt their lesson, and Dutton's not a softie like Morrison. So I think I will just vote Liberal. And because Albanese is so bad, we'll just vote Liberal. Now, that would be terrible if that happens. We certainly want people to vote Liberal ahead of Labor, but we want them to vote for the Libertarian Party as their first preference. If we don't win, our vote goes straight through to the Liberal Party. Why this is important is because in Australia, unlike America and unlike the UK, where they have first past the post voting, so you can win a seat in Parliament or Congress, with 30% of the vote, if there happen to be 4 others who all got less than 30%. But in Australia, with the preferences does more accurately reflect the democratic mood. The other unique thing about Australia is that our Senate and our upper house are voted via proportional representation. So to get a seat here in the New South Wales upper house, if you get sort of 3.5% of the vote, you're in. And that means that 3.5% of people in New South Wales does get their voice, their little voice does get a say. That's a good thing. Now, so what this means is with the preferential voting and the proportional representation situation, it means that we're always going to have a powerful crossbench. So for the viewers that don't know, in parliamentary chamber, you've got the government members, you've got the opposition members, then you've got some in the middle who are minor parties or independents. But in our upper houses, in our Senate and our state upper houses, it's always going to be a crossbench and it's always going to be powerful. Now, the Labor Party has worked out, okay, well, there's this inevitability there's going to be a crossbench. So let's curate a little purist left-wing party called the Greens. And the Greens dominate that space to the left of Labor. They've capped out at about 10 or 12%. That gives them a lot of senators. They've got 4 members here, 4 out of 42. They've got a few in the lower house. So that 10%, 10 to 12% gives you a lot of power. They've got 11 senators out of 76 in Canberra, with 11% of the vote. But Labor's realised, look, we've got to have it. It's an irritation we've got to have the crossbench, but if we've got to have it, let's have some crazy lefties in there. Well, the Liberal Party has not made the same calculation. They just look at the crossbench as an irritation. They don't think about it much. Well, then when they're in government, they can't get their stuff through. So what we have is we have a motley crew on the minor right. We've got Christian parties, a Libertarian Party, they're the best, One Nation, Clive Palmer, shooters parties, other parties, anti-vax parties. And what we think that is really critically needed in Australian politics is that minor right is consolidated, not through a merger, but through the best party who will best be able to perform that role of being a purist 10 to 15% party to the right of the Liberal Party. Who's going to be best placed to do that? Well, I think it's the Libertarian Party, because we are a proudly intellectual party, an ideological party. We're not a single issue party, and we're not a single personality party. We're a principle-based party. So that's what we're trying to do. We don't really want to become a party of government. If we won 51% of the vote, we would very quickly become like the Liberal Party. We'd be a magnet for all these spivs and careerists and opportunists who want to get a seat in Parliament because they want a seat in Parliament. But if we remain pure to our principles, we can get 10 to 15% and we can really help steer the political direction of the country.
Speaking of principles, we were talking before about what you've been doing in New South Wales Parliament, and next year you're intending to announce a Second Amendment clause into the New South Wales Constitution based on the Second Amendment in America, which I'm very excited about, because you cannot defend things like free speech without the means to defend yourself. So firearms is how I became a libertarian, and that's my burning issue, and that's how I test anyone on the purity scale. So what do you think will happen with that? Do you think you'll get a lot of media and attention? And what message are you trying to send to New South Wales saying you deserve to have a Second Amendment in your constitution?
So about 6 months ago, we moved an amendment to the New South Wales Constitution to guarantee the First Amendment, the US First Amendment, about free speech. So we moved it, and that gives us up to half an hour to talk about why we should have in New South Wales the constitutional protection to free speech like our American cousins enjoy. Now, I knew that would not get approved, but I got to give a speech. We could put the speech out on social media. We can make the case. And then we got to get all these other guys have got to get up and say, guys and gals, they can say, well, they didn't want to support it, okay? And the Liberal Party didn't support free speech, okay? Now, some of them did. Mark Latham supported us. Legalise Canada supported us, one or two others. But that was what we're going to do the same thing now with the Second Amendment. Because, you would know, Kate, there is ideological diversity in the libertarian movement. We don't always agree. All libertarians are united in seeing every political issue through the prism of what makes the government smaller. But some of us reach different conclusions on some issues, like abortion. There's about 12 positions of the libertarians on abortion and many other issues. But an issue that all libertarians all agree on is the right to bear arms. So I wasn't impressed with the Libertarian Party candidate in America, Chase Oliver, but he was a 10 out of 10 on guns. Now, when I was a staffer in the Howard government when Port Arthur happened, and I was only 26, I'd never heard the arguments in favour of the Second Amendment. And so I just sort of unthinkingly went along with what Howard was doing then. And then about sort of 10 years later, when I had a little business, and I would often have on in the background American right-wing talkback radio, Rush Limbaugh, Mark Levin, Sean Hannity. And I would hear these guys, particularly Mark Levin, talk about the philosophical reasons about why it's so important and the historical reasons about why it's so important for the citizens to bear arms. and I quite quickly got their point, which is, if we disarm the citizens, there's still a ton of guns out there, and they're all held by the state and criminals. Neither of them are good. But if the citizens have got arms, it can act as a counterweight so that the government can't become a tyranny. And I thought, well, I hate tyranny, and that makes sense. And so those American founding fathers put that thing in there as a Second Amendment. Not so much that they like to go hunting, but they do like to go hunting. Not so much that they want memorabilia, even though some of them do like memorabilia, and they're all good things. Some people want a gun for self-defense, and that's also a sacred right. But what really made me a strong supporter of the right to bear arms was, the dictatorships always disarm the people because guns are power. You can have a billionaire in a room, and one other person in the room might be a homeless person. But if that homeless person's got a gun, he's got all the power because the gun is power. So do we want to give a monopoly to the state to have all that power? And the answer is no. Now, in Australia, that's basically what's happened. And what happened, it was very interesting, the vaccination program between Australia and America. In Australia, 98% of people have taken 2 jabs. In America, they had the same psyop. They had the president, they had the government, they had Fox News, they had academics, the police, the courts, the big corporations, everyone shoving it down the throat of Americans. Take the vax, take the vax, take the vax. Just like it was in Australia. But only 65% of Americans had the double jab. What's the difference? 2 psyops, similar people, similar Australians and Americans got basically pretty similar. But a big difference between the double jab, right? Why is that? The American government knows it can't push the American people around too much, or they can revolt. And that keeps the government in check. So this is why in Australia, bugger all people have heard this argument. Now, there are other politicians who agree with everything I've just said in Australia, but who say, look, there's a war on guns. There's a war on guns. Let's just sort of try and manage the decline and try and sort of slow the decline because they're going to take them all off us. I say that's a recipe for defeat. I say what we've got to do is go out there and make the case, the philosophical case, talk about the Magna Carta and the British Bill of Rights and the American Bill of Rights, say, why did all these great political thinkers say it's really important to have the right to bear arms? And I think when Australians hear this argument, I think that people that'll actually stop the reverse. Once a few people start to say, okay, maybe it's not a good thing that the government's got all the guns. That will start to stop the erosion in gun rights, which is seen non-stop, in the state parliaments everywhere, particularly WA, as you know. So I'm thinking, but we can get to the point where we could get 10 to 20% of people in Australia say, it's dangerous for the government to have all the guns. Well, that'll be good politics for us. It'll also be the sound policy for Australia. Now, the other massive reason why I believe in the right to bear arms, besides the stopping tyranny and self-defense, but the other biggie is invasion. Some bastard at some point over the next 300 years is going to be like an Asian Napoleon. They're going to be like an expansionist, some really charismatic guy, and he's just going to say, we're going to take over the world and we're going to take over Asia. We're going to kick the evil white man out of Australia. It may not happen. Let's hope it does happen. But, gee, we'd be dumb not to prepare for it, right? And Japan was bombing us not that long ago in the age of, my parents were alive, so it's not that long ago. Now, if we persist with this current arrangement where the government's got the guns, and only the government, and there is a foreign invasion threat, well, that foreign invasion threat, if they wipe out our military through bombings, well, then we're all stuffed. The military's gone, but let's say the same thing had happened, but most households in Australia have got one firearm. It might be in Townsville or Tamworth or Broome, wherever, Brisbane. Everywhere they would assume has got a gun and that people know how to use them. Well, then that invader's going to think, oh God, we can wipe out their military. But these little Aussies, they've got a lot of guns. So they'll think, and they're fighting for their life, they're fighting for their homeland. So maybe we don't want to invade them anymore. It's a deterrence to invasion if any invader knows that we're armed up.
So just to go back a few steps, as you're the representative in New South Wales, do you feel a responsibility to move the Overton window in Australia so people actually understand the importance of the Second Amendment? Because that's the trouble I've had doing my Lady Liberty show, and I'm a big shooter, worked for David Linehelm, the most pro-gun senator we've ever had. And I get a bit frustrated and upset when I feel like the Libertarian Party is the vehicle to push the Overton window and talk about things like Second Amendment, talk about self-defense. We have a domestic violence crisis in this country. I've suffered that personally myself, and I'm a trained pistol shooter and couldn't defend my own life in my own home. That's where we're at in Australia. Do you feel it's a responsibility as an elected representative for the Libertarian Party to educate others about our views?
Look, absolutely. I see a lot of people, we want to shift the Overton window. I see people get elected from a minor party and they become obsessed with their own personal re-election. Okay, and all the resources and effort is put into that effort. But we here in the New South Wales Libertarian Party are very evangelical, not in a theological sense, although we do like evangelicals, but we're evangelical in that we want to grow the movement. We want to win converts. And we think we need to sort of wake people up. And this Second Amendment thing will be a way of shifting the Overton window. Now, I suspect the mainstream media will pay no interest in it. If I'd said something stupid about guns, then they might want to sort of magnify that. But if I make an intelligent, philosophical, history-based defence of why people should have the right to bear arms, then I suspect that they'll ignore it. But it doesn't matter that much these days. We've got this magnificent social media, which we're talking on right now. And it's growing and growing and growing. Social media is so powerful, they're so obviously scared of it that they're trying to shut it down. Okay, so they have the lesson of Socrates, only the baddies want to suppress free speech. And so we can still get the message out there through the social media. And that's what we hope to do when we bring this bill in. And I just hope that we can grow the movement by winning one person at a time, waking them up. I used to say to people before COVID, mates of mine, I used to explain to them about how important it is for people to bear the right to bear arms. And I'd say, look, it's about stopping a tyranny. And they'd look at me over a beer or two and I'd say, oh yeah, I get what you're saying, John, but I don't think Australia could ever become a tyranny. And then halfway through COVID, the same type of people who say, oh, I see what you're talking about now, John. So now I think Australia are basically sitting ducks at the moment, sitting ducks to a tyranny. Now we have had, 2.25 centuries of being a very sort of liberal democracy, and having freedom sort of, imprinted in us. That is the truth. So it's not like we're going to morph into East Germany overnight, but and as COVID demonstrated to us, we are on a slow but steady course to, it might take 70 years, but to really might take 7 months, might take 7 years. But we're certainly heading in that direction to where the government's becoming really bossy. And so this is why we need to have that discussion about the Second Amendment now. But in terms, I hope to get re-elected here in 6 years, Kate, but I may not for whatever reason. So if I don't, I absolutely want to be able to look back and say, well, we didn't leave anything on the table. We made the full case for radical libertarianism.
So you've got 6 years left. What's your plan for the next 6 years? What do you want to advance for liberty while you're here?
Well, look, our vote is, there's 42 members here in the upper house. It's not often that our vote is the crucial vote. Sometimes it is in some committees and occasionally it is in the chamber, but not often. So we are using this opportunity to contribute to the debate and to grow our movement. And we're setting up branches around New South Wales. We had a terrific meeting last night for the Senate vote, who the members wanted as their candidate. We had 4 very good candidates. We had a packed house. We had a lot of people voting online. So it feels like there's momentum. We had very good local council election results, which we're very happy about. Got the federal election coming up. But look, even if we, try something, falls flat, well, we just get back up and try twice as hard tomorrow. So we really believe that that all the other political parties are heading us towards a bad place. And we think that we need a radical change in direction, and we need the Libertarian Party to be driving that ideological change. So we want to go all out. So then we've got the big 2027 state election for the upper house, which we'll be contesting vigorously. Now we got about 3.6% of the vote last time. So, if we doubled that, we would very likely would have 2 more MLCs, which would give us a block of 3. Okay, and then then with those 3 out of 42, then it could, after the next election, it could be where the Labor government, assuming they get re-elected, the Labor government could then be in a position where to get any piece of legislation through, they can either talk to the Greens or they can talk to the Libertarians. At the moment, to get anything through, there's about 13 crossbenchers. So the government's got to put together a different majority every time, and sometimes they fail to do so. But if it could be more simplified, and look, Chris Minns, as far as Labor leaders go, he's centrist. He's not Dan Andrews. And he's sort of like Bob Carr or Neville Wran, who are 2 long-term Labor premiers here, who are very sort of, they just wanted to be in business. They just wanted to be in office. They didn't really have an ideological thing. So Minns is centrist, okay? And so he may not. So if we could find ourselves in a position where, we could be, if we've got a little block of 3, and he only needs 2 or 3 votes to get something through. Well, we could say to him, look, we'd like to help you, work with you on the legislation, and then we'll guarantee that we'll support it through. We could make it better. That could put us into a good position. That's the best case scenario for 2026.
In New South Wales. Is there anything else you'd like to add before we round up? It's nearly at the end of the year. It's Christmas is around the corner. It's so great to be back in Sydney. I worked here. This is where I began my journey in the Libertarian movement, working for Senator David Leyonhjelm. It was such an honour to run on the Senate ticket with you in 2022. And it's just so great to have a bold Libertarian voice in New South Wales. So thank you for everything that you do. Is there anything you'd like to tell the people? How can they get involved in the party? What books should they read over Christmas? I know we were talking about Atlas Shrugged before. How's the best way to get people interested and educated about libertarianism in Australia?
Well, if you really want to understand radical libertarianism, the book that I would encourage people to read over the Christmas break is by Murray Rothbard. It's called Anatomy of the State. Now, this is more a pamphlet than a book. It will take you 2 to 3 hours to read. It's only about 65 pages. And it's beautifully written. And Murray Rothbard is the hero of Javier Milei in Argentina. Now, Murray Rothbard is not as famous as Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize for Economics. And he's not sort of like the cult hero that Ayn Rand is, because Ayn Rand was very smart to combine her philosophy with art, and that just has more resonance. But Murray Rothbard was sort of the most radical libertarian because, unlike Ayn Rand, and certainly unlike Milton Friedman, Murray Rothbard said, you know what? We could actually, over time, phase the government out entirely and live in a anarcho-capitalist society. Now, many people out there will think, that's wild, that's wacky, okay? And that was my reaction. But when you read Murray Rothbard, Anatomy of the State, you will see that really the state is just the biggest, most heavily armed gang out there. That's how they get their power. They might say they get it through democracy, or the monarchy might say they get it through God's gift, God's divine right to rule. They might say whatever it is, but at the end of the day, it's the same thing. It's a heavily armed gang who gets its way. And and that's, so I mean, we have all these laws that get passed are underwritten by violence, by the state's threat of violence. Now, we're not against governance. In a truly free society, a voluntary society, there would be a lot of arrangements in place, which would be like the arrangements we have in a strata building.
Mm-hmm.
People voluntarily move into a strata building, whether they're a renter or a buyer, and they voluntarily agree to certain rules. Now, if they don't like those rules, or if they don't abide by those rules, they can get kicked out. But we could organise society in a voluntary capacity for pretty much everything. Ayn Rand says, well, look, the government should be very small, but we still need it for the police, the courts, and the roads. Police, courts, and defence. But Murray Rothbard says, look, we can even deal with these issues. I mean, I think the legal system is so convoluted and expensive. It's a rich man's game. Okay, but I mean, what would happen in the private law system is that, if let's say I bought a car off you for $10,000, we'd have a contract.
Mm-hmm.
And we say if we end up having a dispute, like the car breaks down, we would agree what court we would go to in advance.
Mm-hmm.
We might want to choose a cheapy court, or we might want an expensive court. If I bought a $1 million Lamborghini off you or something. So we could, and then that court would basically, we say, look, we both agree with what this independent guy will say if we have a dispute, and he's only going to charge us, $300 to resolve our dispute. But we both agree that we will abide by whatever it says. That's simple and quick.
Mm-hmm.
We can sort. The legal system is just such a nightmare,
Mm.
and there's so much money being made out of it by all these bloody barristers and everybody. But we can have a private law system which can pretty much sort things out. So anyway, even if Murray Rothbard's wrong, and even if the ideal is that we do need to have some type of a state, which may well be the case, most libertarians, I would say, look, they'd say minicists, they say we do need a minimal state, okay? And so even if Murray Rothbard is wrong, it's good to understand his perspective, because the government now is over 50% of the GDP. So we need to sort of head in the direction of zero. We might get down to a 5% government or a 10% government and say, okay, well, this is actually working perfectly, so we don't need to go any further. Maybe not, but we'll see. But anyway, that's my Christmas gift to you.
Anatomy of the state. It's so funny. We were looking at buying Christmas presents yesterday, and that's one that we bought for some of their families. So,
very good.
Well, it's an absolute pleasure to be here with you in Sydney, JR. Thank you for everything you've done for the party. Thank you for being brave and bold. I cannot wait to watch your speech on the Second Amendment. Merry Christmas. Happy New Year. Cheers to 2025.
Thanks for coming in, Kate.
JR.
Lovely to see you.